My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Lisa Lewis, who will be talking about sleep and well-being, sleep-friendly changes to help teens thrive. Take it away, Lisa.
Thank you, Charlene. I'm so excited to be here and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I am going to quickly share my screen, so bear with me here. Okay, here we go. All right, so as Charlene mentioned, I am Lisa Lewis, and I have been immersed in this issue of teen sleep for the last 8 years. So I am a parent. I am also a parenting journalist. So for me, this whole journey started in 2015 because that was when my oldest of my 2 kids, my son, was just entering high school. And at that point, our local high school at our district here in Southern California started at 7:30 in the morning, which was very early. It was the earliest he had ever had to go to school, all the way going, through the school system. And it quickly became obvious that it was just too early for him and for us as a family. I was the one driving him to school every day, and I could just look over at him sitting there in the passenger seat. He was there, his eyes were open, but he was pretty quiet and subdued. He was hardly alert and ready for a full day of learning. So of course, I, put on my reporter hat and started looking into this. I wanted to know why our school started so early. Were we the only ones that did? And quickly realized a few things. The first was, no, this was not unique to our district. It was the case in so many districts around the country, but more importantly, it was indeed too early. So again, this was 2015, and the previous year, 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics had just released a very influential policy statement recommending that middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 in the morning. So clearly our start time was nowhere in range. So I continued researching this. I spoke to so many of the various sleep researchers around the country, started writing about it. As a freelance journalist, one of the articles that I wrote was an op-ed that ran in the Los Angeles Times the following fall, so September of my son's sophomore year, and it was called "Why School Should Start Later in the Day." That op-ed ended up being read by one of our California state senators, Anthony Portantino, whose district is in Los Angeles. And at the time, he also had a high schooler, and it just so happened their high school was in the midst of discussions about the start time. So this was an issue that resonated with him. So he literally read my op-ed in the paper, and he decided it was an issue he wanted to look into further with an eye towards introducing a bill on the topic. And that is exactly what ended up happening. And I got swept up in that entire journey. In fact, I got looped in even before that bill got introduced, which was February of 2017. And it was a journey. I call it a journey because it took 2.5 years from that point to when Governor Newsom finally signed it into law. And I just was immersed during that whole time period. I testified up in Sacramento. End result, that got signed into law, and there was a 3-year implementation window. So that law finally went into effect July of 2022. So this is only the second school year that this law has been in effect. And again, we were the first state in the entire country to pass a law like this, setting minimum allowed start times. So I was just immersed in all the research in this whole issue, looking not just at start times, but the broader issue of teen sleep and the ramifications of being sleep deprived and all the other ways we could help. And so as a result of that, I ended up writing my book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen, which also came out last year. And really, I wrote it with parents in mind to focus on 3 main areas: how sleep changes when our kids hit the teen years, all of the many profound ways that sleep affects well-being, and then also to offer specific advice on how we can help our teens. And this is not working. I am so sorry. This suddenly my clicker is not working. Oh, there we go. Okay, so first, let's just take a step back and look at sleep in general. So sleep is a very complex process. And it's actually kind of funny because up until a couple hundred years ago, the prevailing wisdom was that when we fell asleep, we were essentially unconscious. And of course, we know now that is not the case. There is such a tremendous amount going on while we are asleep. And we spend a third of our lives asleep. So clearly it's a pretty important time. So I'm just going to walk you quickly through the stages of sleep because we cycle through all of these stages each night. And in fact, each cycle is maybe 90 minutes or so. So there's generally 4 to 6 cycles per night. So very first, stage 1, transition. That is literally when we are transitioning from being awake to being asleep. And it's the very lightest stage. It's very fragile. You can very easily be woken up from it. So you can startle yourself awake. You can be woken up by a noise. And so this is only a few minutes or so, but this is that stage of just kind of drifting off to sleep. So from stage 1, we enter stage 2, light sleep, which is, it's called light sleep, but it is not as light as stage 1, which really truly is light sleep. So this is really only light in comparison to the stage 3 and the REM sleep, because it's deep sleep, stage 3 is the one that clearly is very deep. And so this is just light in relation to that. So during this phase, stage 2, light sleep, our breathing and our heart rate continue to slow. And this is a stage that we continue to return to throughout the night. In fact, our stage 2 sleep makes up about half of our overall time asleep. So this is also, you can think of it sort of as the runway stage that then leads into these deeper stages. So stage 3, deep sleep, is indeed the deepest stage of sleep and the most difficult to wake from. So if you are woken up from this stage, you're likely to feel disoriented and groggy. I mean, it really takes a few minutes to kind of fully wake up. So this stage, though, is when there's so much happening in terms of general maintenance, things like the glymphatic system, which is basically what's called the brain's garbage disposal system. So clearing out that waste. It's primarily when growth hormone is released. It's when the immune system is strengthened. So there's so much going on during this stage. And then finally, there's REM sleep, rapid eye movement. And this is the stage when most dreams occur. So one of the researchers I spoke with terms this hot brain, cold body, because our bodies are temporarily immobilized, and that's so that we don't act out our dreams. So as I mentioned, we cycle through these stages over the course of the night, but the balance of the amount of time we spend actually does shift over the course of the night as well. So for instance, for REM sleep, about 3/4 of that takes place during the second half of the night. So when it comes to having to wake too early, which could be for school, but it could also be like before school practices. Well, if you're waking too early, you may well be cutting into that REM sleep, which is when our brains are actually, in addition to dreaming, it's a stage where creativity is prominent. So that's when it's not just assessing and integrating the information we've gathered, but also forging new insights. Now, I want to also highlight a few areas that are particularly relevant for teens. So first, sleep is when our brains are sorting through and processing all of the information and stimuli that we've gathered over the course of the day, and sorting through that and moving it from short-term into long-term storage. All that is happening while we are asleep. Second, sleep is essential for healing and growth. As I mentioned, the pituitary gland releases growth hormone while we're sleeping. And as the name implies, that is essential for growth, but it also activates the body's ability to heal. So healing from injuries, but also even recovering from, say, a hard workout. And then finally, our teens are in the midst of a major phase of brain development focused on pruning and remodeling. So we've all heard the phrase, use it or lose it. And that is exactly what's taking place when it comes to brain cells. In essence, the neurons that are being used the most develop the strongest connections between them, and the ones that aren't being used get paired away. And I should mention that's because there is a surplus that was initially created. And so getting rid of this excess during this pruning phase is what allows the remaining neurons to function more effectively. And this pruning takes place primarily during sleep. There is another process that is also taking place, and that is the remodeling phase. And that has to do with improving the connections between the neurons. So one of the neuroscientists I interviewed for the book compared the process to upgrading from a dirt road to a paved freeway, just to give you a sense of the kind of improvement in the speed of processing that takes place. And then there is also increased connectivity between the areas of the brain that takes place during adolescence. So the end result of all of this, which is taking place over the entire course of adolescence and actually even into the early adulthood years, when this is all complete, our teens are able to behave less impulsively, to focus their attention more effectively, and to make better decisions. So, how much sleep does all of this require? So, this chart shows you the sleep recommendations by age, and this is from the National Sleep Foundation. And these were updated in 2015, and in many cases, it actually broadened the range. So you can see there for teens, 14 to 17 years old, the recommended range is 8 to 10 hours every single night. And the range previously had been 8.5 to 9.5 hours. So our teens, up until they hit age 18, they should be getting 8 to 10 hours every single night for optimal functioning. Now, I want to point out something, which is you can see 8 hours is the minimum for our teens. That's a number we sort of, often hear as kind of the number that's good for all of us. Well, it's great for us as adults, that's right in the middle, but for our teens, that is the minimum they should be getting. And then you can also see for our younger teens and our tweens, they need even more sleep. They need 9 to 11 hours every single night. So these are the official recommendations, but we all know there is a huge gap between the recommendations and the reality. And that's true for adults too, as a society. Unfortunately, we are frequently all sleep deprived, but for our teens, it's particularly acute. So the CDC just released data, in fact, earlier this year. This is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, showing that only 23% of US high schoolers are getting at least 8 hours of sleep on a school night. So again, less than 1/4 of high schoolers are even hitting that minimum on school nights. So why are our teens not getting enough sleep? So first and foremost, there is a key change that takes place during adolescence that affects the timing of teen sleep. That's this circadian rhythm shift that I've noted here on this slide, which has to do with the sleep-wake cycle. That entire cycle shifts later as our kids enter puberty. So what happens is melatonin, which is the hormone that primes us to start feeling sleepy, begins to be released later in the evening than it used to. And it also begins to subside later in the morning compared to what happens with our younger kids. So that's why our teens are not feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock at night, and why they want to sleep in later in the morning. So you can see, though, that for them to get those 8 to 10 hours of sleep, they need to be getting to bed at a reasonable hour and then not waking too early in the morning. So when I say 11 o'clock, that's about when they're starting to feel sleepy. But we know, of course, that some teens are not even getting to bed at that time. So this schedule is very different than what our kids were like when they were younger, when they used to bound out of bed at 6 in the morning, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Teens do not do that. It's also a different schedule than we have as adults. So I have found in my household, and you may have found the same, where your teen suddenly is chatty, wants to come in and talk to you late at night. that's the time where I, as an adult, am really winding down. And so it just kind of highlights the fundamental difference in the sleep timing and the sleep schedule that our teens have. Now, I'd also like to just touch briefly on a few very common misconceptions that are out there about teen sleep, because these are things that I tend to hear a lot. The first is, well, if they're so tired, why don't they just go to bed earlier? Implying that they're somehow stubborn and just staying up late. So this gets back to the circadian rhythm shift that I just mentioned. Biologically, they are no longer feeling sleepy as early. So, I mean, technically, yes, they could go to bed earlier, but unless the teen is utterly exhausted, you put them to bed at 9 o'clock, they're just going to lay there and stare at the ceiling. Because again, that melatonin has shifted to a later schedule. They are not feeling sleepy early in the evening. So fundamentally, that's why going to bed earlier is not really an option. Second, oh, well, it's tech. They just need to get off their phones. So this is something that has been studied. And the bottom line, of course, yes, you can sabotage your sleep if you are up until 2 a.m. playing video games or chatting with friends. However, being on devices like phones is not the primary driver of teen sleep deprivation, which actually predates smartphones. And then this last one too, which is sort of what often ends up happening, which is catching up on weekends, which is a bit of a misnomer because you can't truly catch up on weekends. If you think of it like food, if you're not eating enough during the week, you can't really quite make up for it on the weekends. I mean, qualitatively, that's very different. And if you're building up a sleep debt over the course of the week, that's a lot of hours to try and quote unquote make up on the weekends. So there's that reality. There's also the fact that when your sleep schedule is wildly different on the weekends than during the weekdays, you run the risk of essentially creating what's known as social jet lag, which is like jet lag, meaning that your body clock is really out of sync with the clock. So let's say you sleep in until noon on Sunday. Well, it's going to make it that much harder to feel sleepy when bedtime rolls around on Sunday night. It's going to make it hard to wake up on Monday morning. And so it really just perpetuates the cycle. And then finally, another one, a big misconception is that somehow getting by on too little sleep is building endurance, making them good at it, somehow benefiting our teens. And in fact, we know that it is actually just the opposite, that being sleep deprived drags down their academic performance, their sports performance, their driving ability, and their mental health. So let's look first at what it does to their mental health. So first, when our teens don't get enough sleep, their emotions run hotter. And it's not just teens, that's true for all of us. We are all more reactive and impulsive if we haven't gotten enough sleep. The difference, though, is that our teens' brains are less well equipped to cope with this sleep loss. Gets back to the brain development I was referencing. Our teens don't yet have a mature prefrontal cortex, which is what provides the impulse control and the other executive functioning skills and helps kind of balance out the effects of that sleep loss. Also, when they are not getting enough sleep, it exacerbates mental health issues. So, for example, depression. Inadequate sleep is linked with depression, and there are numerous studies that show that teens who don't get enough sleep are more likely to report feeling depressed. And even if they don't have depression, their ability to experience pleasure is muted when they're sleep deprived. This is called anhedonia. And as I said, it means joy is muted, and it means they're not able to sort of recognize and derive small moments of joy, going through their days, and they're just sort of trudging through. So it's a quality of life issue. And then finally, and most concerning, the less sleep teens get, the more their suicide risk goes up. The highest risk of suicide is during the preteen to young adulthood years. And in fact, according to the CDC, suicide is the third leading cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds, and it is the second leading cause of death for 10 to 14-year-olds. Now, there is another relevant point that unfortunately plays into this, which is that being sleep deprived increases the risk of impulsive behaviors. And research shows that sleep deprived teens do indeed make riskier choices. So, speaking of risky behaviors, I'm just going to share with you a quiz that I share in the book that one researcher gave to teens and adults. So I'm going to share these examples and just ask you to think about whether any of these seem like good ideas. Jumping off a roof, eating a cockroach, swimming with sharks. So I think we would all agree that these are bad ideas. And you will be relieved to know that not just the adults, but the teens in the study also said, yeah, those are bad ideas. But what was interesting was that it took the teens longer to come to that conclusion, that they actually had to think about each of those scenarios before making up their minds. So this gets back to the brain remodeling I was talking about and the slower processing speed. Research also shows that as teens' sleep goes down, their odds for a range of risky behaviors, including substance use, go up. And that includes drinking alcohol and using drugs. And there's one other key point here that compared to adults, adolescents are more prone to addiction. So they are more likely to take risks and seek out pleasure, and they are quicker to learn new skills and behaviors. And this gets back to that point that the more often specific neurons are being used, the stronger the connections between them become. So, speaking of risky behaviors, driving. Teens are already dangerous behind the wheel. They are more likely to crash than drivers in all other age groups, and the crash risk is the highest for 16 to 19-year-olds. So, why is this? Well, first and foremost, they are new drivers. They are not experienced. They don't have the same judgment that's come about from years of experience. They don't yet have that as second nature. So, a squirrel darts out in front of them. Do they brake? Do they swerve? Things like that that you just know after having driven for years is all new to them. So they are brand new drivers out there on the road. They are also more likely to be distracted while driving. AAA, in fact, did a survey, and they found that more than 1/3 of the teen drivers that they surveyed said that at least once in the past 30 days they had texted while driving, and almost as many said that they had run a red light at least once during the same time frame. Now, add in the effects of drowsy driving. So drivers across the board, not just teens, adults too, drivers who have not gotten enough sleep are more dangerous on the road. They're more likely to make judgment errors, to react more slowly, and even to have micro sleeps, meaning you fall asleep, even if it's just for a fraction of a second, but your car is still moving forward during that time. So bottom line, drowsy driving is dangerous for all drivers, but it is even more dangerous for our teen drivers who are new drivers. And then, of course, we have the effects of being sleep deprived in school. So pretty much every article I've ever seen on teen sleep has a picture like this of a kid fast asleep on their desk. And I spoke with teachers who said, yeah, this unfortunately is the reality. They sometimes literally have kids who are falling asleep in class. But even kids who are not falling asleep, who are merely sleep deprived, are not learning the same way they would if they were not sleep deprived. And that's because there are 3 specific ways that learning is impacted. The first is when our teens are acquiring new information. So when they're sitting in class and they're learning or they're reading and studying on their own. The second is retaining that information, because again, that happens during sleep. That's when that newly acquired information is consolidated and stabilized and strengthened. And then finally, being sleep deprived also impairs their ability to retrieve that information. So trying to remember back to what they learned in class so they can do their homework, or just, remember what they had learned while they're taking a test. And then, of course, there are broader effects too. Everything from the ability to pay attention and follow directions to the ability to handle stress and get along with others. Now, I just want to touch briefly on this because, again, we were the first state in the entire country and still the only state with a law in effect that sets minimum allowed start times. So this law just went into effect July of 2022. So this is the second year it's been in effect. Florida actually recently passed a similar law. But again, they've got a 3-year implementation window, so that doesn't go into effect until 2026. And there are a few other states that are also currently considering passing this kind of a law as well. So our law in California sets minimum allowed start times for the state's public and charter middle schools of 8 o'clock or later, and for public and charter high schools of 8:30 or later. And again, this harkens back to that American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement that I mentioned, and the fact that there is such a large body of research that has shown repeatedly that when schools start later, teens get more sleep. Now, start times are obviously an important policy change to help teens get more sleep. It affects primarily what time they get up in the morning. However, in addition to start times, there are a number of other factors and things that we can do that are focused on the other side of the equation, what time they're going to bed at night. So the first is really to ask this question of, is your teen on overload? The issue of overscheduling is very real, and it is all too easy for things to kind of creep up until finally they've hit this critical mass. Because our teens, of course, have the time they're in school, but then they have homework for each class. And when they are taking advanced or honors level classes, that homework load for that class is likely going to increase. And in addition to their schoolwork, they're frequently involved in other activities at school, band, speech and debate, sports teams. They may be involved in extracurriculars outside of school, like club sports. They may have a job. So the recommendation is to really try and sit down and figure out how much time is already allocated for all of these different commitments that they have, including, as I mentioned, the potentially extra homework for those classes, as well as all these other extracurriculars that they have, and add all of that up and see how many hours that takes, and whether there is even an 8 to 10 hour window left in their day, in that 24-hour cycle, to give them the opportunity to be able to get enough sleep. Bearing in mind, of course, that they still need time to be able to eat meals and have a little bit of downtime too. But the bottom line, if you add all of their time commitments up and you see that the cumulative impact is such that it's making it very difficult for them to be able to get 8 to 10 hours of sleep, it may be time to reevaluate. Now, tech use. So tech and sleep is a huge topic. I have an entire chapter about this because tech is omnipresent. And when it comes to sleep, and specifically our teen sleep, there are 3 specific ways that being online does end up impacting their sleep. So the first is time displacement. The amount of time being online, including watching TV, cuts into your sleep time. So again, if you were up until 2 a.m. playing video games, watching TV, what have you, that is literally cutting into the time you could be sleeping. The second is that the content itself is usually stimulating and engaging. It is the opposite of what you want when you are trying to kind of wind down and get ready to disconnect from the day and drift off to sleep. If you are playing a video game or watching a movie, or if you're involved in some sort of emotional chat, that is something that is going to rev you up, not help you calm down. And then the third aspect is the blue light aspect, because the light that is emitted by these backlit devices often is emitting more blue light, which is the part of the spectrum that cues us to feel more alert. So that's great in the morning, that's great during the daytime, but at night, to be using devices that are emitting blue light, then the effect is that it can delay the release of melatonin, which is the hormone that primes us to start feeling sleepy. So that too can end up impacting sleep. Now, having said all that, it's a tricky topic. Tech is a huge part of our kids' social world, and it does have a valid role to play as part of that. And so I think that's important to recognize and to keep in mind. You know, when I was in high school many, many years ago, I would be on the telephone for hours with my phone, with my friends. Well, that's not what kids do now. They're online on social media, you know, they're texting. That is what they do. And that is part of how they do stay connected with their friends. So it does have a valid role to play. The second thing is just to be aware that everything that our kids and that we are doing online, all of those apps, everything we're interacting with has specifically been designed to be as immersive as possible and to keep us engaged as long as possible. And in some ways, teens are pretty much the perfect audience for this. Their brains are already primed to seek out rewards. So when you think about it, that's exactly what likes are on social media. That's what leveling up is in a video game. So they are interacting with and staying engaged with all of these apps exactly as intended. And it's really tricky. It's tricky for all of us, but even more so for our teens. And even if you think about TV shows, for instance, if you're streaming a television show and you come to the end of an episode and the next episode, there's just this automatic countdown that if you don't do anything, it just seamlessly dumps you into that next episode. That's another example. So all of this has been designed to keep us and to keep our teens engaged as long as possible. That is what we're up against. So best practices, what can we do? So there are a couple of specific best practices I want to mention that are official recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics. The first is they recommend getting off of devices 1 hour before bedtime. Now, I recognize that is not always super easy to do. However, that is the official recommendation. I think that's important to know, and even something to work toward, even if it's a half hour before bedtime, but just to recognize that getting off of the devices and not being on them up until the very minute you turn off the light is an important strategy. Second official recommendation is to remove those devices from the bedroom at night. Ideally, charge them in a central location like the kitchen. At a minimum, turn off notifications. There is no need other than, breakthrough emergency phone numbers, why any of us need to be woke in the middle of the night with, a notification that somebody has liked a post or, has sent a text. Now, saying all of these, is easy. I recognize that getting teens buy-in is not always quite as easy. So often this is going to be a process. It's not going to be a one-time conversation, particularly if you have not had these kind of sort of house rules in place. It is probably going to take some socializing this, and it's going to take some ongoing discussions. And ideally, getting your teens buy-in, getting them to provide input, talking to them, having conversations about what are the aspects of tech that they find are most distracting for them. Talking about what are some solutions. If they're using their phone as an alarm clock, maybe you can get them an actual alarm clock. I mean, sort of trying to brainstorm and work through it, but doing it with them. And then also a key part of that is for us as parents to be good role models. So if we're instituting or enforcing a house rule of no phones in the bedtime at night, that they're all being charged in the kitchen, that's where our phones need to be too. So really making sure that we are being a role model. So I have to share, this is from the Sharper Image Catalog. This showed up last year during the holiday season, and I saved this page because I thought it was just so perfect. You can see here the testimonial from Janet. She loves this tray because it holds her devices so she can surf the web and check email in bed. So these are not best practices. This is an example of the kind of stuff that, if we're doing this, it makes it that much harder, obviously, to be asking our kids to be following best practices. And this is not a best practice. Getting back to the whole need to disengage before bed, obviously surfing the web and checking emails means your brain is still on, you're still connected to work, and that is not helping you obviously drift off to sleep. So I saved this just because this is sort of a tech don't. So what should you be doing instead? I mentioned getting off of devices. So instead, during that ideally 1 hour time frame before bed, encourage your teens to develop some sort of a wind down routine. So this is a sequence of steps to ease the transition to sleep. It's very similar to what we did when our kids were little. Often it was an elaborate routine. It was reading a couple of storybooks in a set order, and it was snuggling, and it was always making sure we did these steps and we did them in the same order. And this was a way to sort of signal, okay, we're winding down, we're getting ready to drift off to sleep. So it's the same general concept, coming up with what is that new routine going to be, what sequence of activities, because it kind of primes our brain then, oh, we're starting to wind down for bed. And it can be, whatever works. It can be reading a book. I read a print book before bed. It can be taking a warm bath. It can even be listening to a podcast, which I know is tech, but is not nearly the same kind of level of interactivity. So if there's some kind of relaxing podcast that your teen likes, it can be yoga or meditation. It can be coloring. But it's for them to ideally be the ones coming up with what is it that relaxes them and helps them disengage from everything that they've been doing over the course of the day and help them kind of make that transition to sleep. Second, paying attention to naps and weekend sleep. So I talked about weekend sleep earlier, how sleeping in late on the weekends really can just perpetuate this cycle. So naps also can be an issue. They can also help. They are a stopgap measure, though, and I think that's what's important to remember. Couple caveats about naps. If you nap too late in the day, or if you nap too long, you are going to enter into that deeper phase of sleep, which is going to make it harder to wake up, and also you may have a hard time getting to bed at a reasonable hour. But just to remember that naps really are a stopgap measure. So if your teen regularly isn't getting enough sleep during the day and relying on a nap, that's a sign that really to look at their nighttime sleep and see if there's a way to extend that rather than relying on the nap to kind of be filling in, because it is not qualitatively ultimately the same, unfortunately. And then finally, to make sleep a family priority. So this gets back to what I was just noting a couple slides earlier, setting a good example, being a role model, but also being collaborative, that this probably is going to be a topic that is not just a one and done deal, that having ongoing discussions and really recognizing that it's kind of a tricky balance between helping set the guidelines, but also helping them manage their own sleep. So for younger teens, you're probably going to end up being more involved in the process. For older teens, they probably aren't going to like that quite as well, and they are ready developmentally to be taking on more of this. Actually, the best way to sum it up, this was one of the researchers I spoke with. She said the goal is you want warmth with structure, but also with some autonomy. So it really is that balance, and recognizing that the autonomy piece grows as our kids get older. And the ultimate goal of all this is to help them set sleep habits that they will take with them. Because once they leave home, ultimately they will be the ones responsible for all of this. And then finally, to remember, there is nothing that we do better as a result of being sleep deprived. So getting by on too little sleep is not a badge of honor. And just because you can do it doesn't mean that it's a good idea. You are not doing anything better as a result of being sleep deprived, that we all function better when we have gotten enough sleep. And then finally, to remember, this gets back to the parenting piece of it, that when we as parents are well rested and our teens are well rested, it really sets the stage for more positive interactions across the board. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Lisa Lewis. That was an amazing discussion. And parents, I'm looking at all these incredible questions and I feel your pain. This is a really tough topic. It's a really tough topic with busy teens, and it's a really tough topic in schools like in the Fremont Union High School District, where kids are high achieving, families are high achieving, colleges matter, grades matter. So Lisa, let's just kind of go after this, okay? We have a number of questions about a topic that we've been talking about for a long, long time. My own school district, my home district, Sequoia Union High School District, changed school start times more than a decade ago. And that was a great thing based on the research coming out of Stanford sleep clinics. But again, Lisa, thank you for your work to change start times for the rest of the kids. Super important. But here's the kicker: parent rights. I wonder about my teens' health and quality of life because of lack of sleep due to way too much homework. The teachers and schools need to be more aware. You talked about balance and extracurricular activities, but homework is really a big one. Do you have any suggestions for parents who are just frustrated by the amount of hours their kids are spending on homework?
Yeah, no, that is a tricky one. There are a couple things. The first is one thing that I didn't really realize until I started having some more of these conversations is oftentimes the turn-in time for assignments, for kids to turn in their assignments online, the default time is 11:59 p.m. So that's something that can be adjusted. I mean, that's a pretty easy thing to change. It's just what the system defaults to, because obviously if the kids know they have till midnight to turn something in, that kind of sort of tacitly encourages them to do it a little bit later at night. The other piece about the amount of homework, that is tricky. I mean, I get it. I have a college student and a just graduated high schooler, so I absolutely get it. And this is one where I think it's a longer term challenge. It can be conversations with the school. There are schools that have actually implemented limits in terms of how many advanced level classes or AP level classes kids are allowed to take, particularly for in the younger years of high school. So it is conversations about that. It's also conversations, I think, within the family about how many advanced level classes perhaps are truly necessary. And I know it's tricky because I know you feel like you have to do all this in order to get into a good school, and you have to get into a good school in order to have a good career, and you have to have a good career to have a good life. But at some point, one additional class is not going to make or break your kid's future. And I think to recognize that there is a very real harm that unfortunately we can be unfortunately inflicting, which is the mental health piece. And so in some ways it can be hard to buck against the system, but perhaps even considering dialing down the number of the advanced level classes, but also having those conversations with the school, I think.
All right, fair enough, Lisa, because I know I had children that took lots and lots of AP classes, and I had a daughter who put herself to bed at 10 o'clock at night every night. And I had a son who wanted to play those Quest video games all night. So it's just hard. But I think involving the kids in the decision making and doing like you suggested, Lisa, planning, there's only 24 hours in a day. How are you spending those hours? And letting the kids do that, it can be helpful just to let them see where the hours are going, right?
Yeah, and then also for them to understand that the parents understand about the value of sleep too, because there's so many expectations on our kids. And so just to kind of look at our own role in that, and it really is tricky because it's expectations the kid puts on themselves. It can be expectations within the household, among their peers, that whole, thing of lack of sleep as a badge of honor, which is really a harmful way of being ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the pediatrician telling me that it helps to tell kids, especially teenage boys, that you grow during sleep.
Yes, absolutely. That is primarily when growth hormone is released. So it is so true.
Right? Okay, here's a good question from a dad. If my teen isn't supposed to go to bed earlier, then when is he supposed to sleep? He has to be at school before 7:30 a.m.
Yeah, this is tricky. So the school start times, in California, for public schools, that is now the law. I know private schools in general tended to start later. So I don't know if that's the actual first period or if that's 0 periods and before school practices, which of course can end up undercutting, having the healthiest school start time in the world. So I guess that would be the question, is why? Because 0 periods, again, those really are cutting into sleep. That's where if you don't have, you only have so much control over what time they're getting up. And if it is something you can control, like whether they're taking a 0 period, whether they're choosing to do a sport that has to have before school practice. Otherwise, it is focusing more on those nighttime best practices. Recognizing though that even so, they're probably not going to be ready to fall asleep at 9 o'clock at night. But nevertheless, paying attention to the tech, the blue light, the wind down routine, all that stuff can help. But it is tricky because truly they need 8 to 10 hours. And if they have to get up too early, that really can make it quite difficult to get the recommended hours of sleep.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. So you mentioned blue light. There's a parent who asks here, this is a good question, why do teachers insist all work be done on a computer if blue light should be limited at night?
That is a great question. Yeah, I'm not an educator, so I don't know. Yeah, that's a really great question. I will say this, a couple things. The first is what time the kids are doing their homework, because it's natural to want to kind of procrastinate. And of course, when they know they can turn it in at practically midnight, that also plays into it. So as parents, we can be encouraging them to start earlier. And this is also getting back to overscheduling, because if they're so busy that they don't even get home and finish, eating dinner and able to even sit down to their homework till 9 at night, that's also playing into it. The other piece though is you can look at blue blocker glasses, which can help. But bearing in mind, the blue light is really the least of those 3 aspects, the others being the time displacement and the engagement aspects of tech that are impacting sleep. And you can also dim the screen. Phones often have that. You can automatically set it. And the other thing is thinking about the distance of the screen from your eyes, because if you're on a phone and it's just inches from your face, that's actually going to have more of an impact than, say, a TV screen across the room. And I recognize that's not the same as a computer monitor, but again, just keeping in mind that dimming, the blue light blocking, blue blocker glasses, and then also the distance from the screen.
Okay, thank you for that. So we're getting some questions about literal parental kinds of controls around technology. Here's a parent who asks, is it a good practice to cancel access to Wi-Fi after a certain hour?
Yeah, that is definitely something that can work. I think especially with younger kids. It gets trickier as the kids get older. I think it all depends on what rules you've already had in place, because once they're in place, it's much easier to enforce them than if you're coming in and trying to retrofit these kind of rules. Something like that can work though, or having a house rule that, things get turned off at a certain hour. And if it takes something like that to enforce it, perhaps that works. That can also give the teen an excuse. It's kind of like an out, of needing to be kind of on call for their friends late at night, because there is this pressure they feel to do that because that's when their friends are online. So in some ways, allowing the parent to be like the bad guy, like, oh, well, my parents turn off the access, or, there's a rule, I'm not allowed on after X. Like in some ways that could help them. But I think it does depend also on what kind of rules have already been in place, what kind of discussions have happened. So I could see it working, but I could see it also not going over well.
Well, that's a good point, Lisa. I think that it's important for us as parents to be that person, to give our kids the out of saying, oh, I wish I could, but my mom says, no, I can't use the phone after 11 o'clock at night, because kids, especially girls, want to solve the world's problems in the middle of the night. We know this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And, as far as getting off of devices before lights out, there's also the fact that sometimes teens are still online after lights out. That gets back to why you ideally don't want the phone right there by the bed. It's just too tempting.
Well, we've got a bunch of questions, obviously, about how difficult it is getting a teenager to literally go to bed. As one parent said, the more we encourage them to go to sleep, the less they want to do it. And then the nighttime routines get dragged out, long showers and everything else. Do you have any advice for a 14-year-old boy or girl who just won't get enough sleep?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I will tell you, as a parent, I was deep in all this research and telling my teens about it, at dinner. And I got to tell you, like, they were sometimes just laughing, like, oh, here comes mom again with her advice. I mean, they don't always want to hear it. And it's very difficult when you get into a power struggle. Um, to the extent you can hold the line, though, it really does make a difference. Research shows that helping set and maintain a bedtime actually helps. There are so many kids who practice this, what they call it is bedtime procrastination. And, as you would expect, when there's more bedtime procrastination, kids do get to bed later. They end up getting less sleep. So it's tricky. I mean, because being punitive obviously doesn't go over well, but if you have family roles where the devices are getting out of the bedroom, I think this gets back to that can help. But it is also tricky. But this is also where even encouraging them to try certain things, have it be an experiment. Like, well, try putting your phone on the other side of the room, and then, how was that? How did that go? Because the more, obviously that you can get a 14-year-old to kind of experience it and buy into it on their own, probably the better degree of success. But yeah, I feel for you. I've been there. It is hard. I mean, kids are stubborn, and again, the tech is designed to suck them in, and so it's hard. It really is hard.
Yeah, but those are good suggestions. I read today that teens get like 250 pings a day with notifications. They can actually turn those notifications off and get a little bit more freedom from their devices. Okay, Lisa, there's so many great questions coming in. We have just a few minutes. Let's see if we can answer a couple more, okay?
Sure.
Here's a good one. How does exercise affect sleep patterns?
Yeah, that's a great one. So regular exercise absolutely helps. You ideally don't want to do it right before bed because then you can still be kind of revved up. But regular exercise really is key to helping kids feel sleepy on time. They've done studies, in fact, showing that when you're sedentary, you do tend to not feel sleepy until later at night. And the other thing when it comes to exercise, I will just point out for anyone who has a teen or a tween or a kid who plays sports, sleep is a competitive advantage. I didn't have time to get into that today, but sleep, absolutely, it's something that's recognized from the pros on down that bottom line, it really is a competitive advantage. So that can be a selling point to any of you who have kids who play sports.
That's right. Pull that data up and just put the article in the kids' bedroom or in the email, and that can make a difference. All right. So, Lisa, I feel the frustration of parents who want so badly for their kids to get enough sleep, but they're overwhelmed by homework and school schedules and lunchtime at 11:30 and all of that. You did this. You accomplished this change, helped to accomplish this change in school schedules. Do you have any advice for how parents can start a conversation about sleep with school administrators, coaches, and so on?
Yeah, I think that having a presentation at school can be a great way to get started. I will say here in California, the California State PTA was a tremendous partner. In fact, they literally co-sponsored this bill because recognizing how, sleep plays into kids' well-being, and they're all about kids' well-being. So I think even having a presentation, perhaps hosted by the PTA, similar to this presentation, kind of just an overview, because I think so often people don't understand some of the basics of teen sleep and that they're not being lazy and they do have this different schedule. Absolutely, for coaches, I would hope that they are aware of some of this. I mean, particularly in the Bay Area, like Andrea Godala has been very vocal about, how focusing on his sleep enabled him, who was already a world-class athlete, to become even better. I have a whole chapter on sports in my book, actually, but this is something that if coaches are not aware of, absolutely, this is the kind of thing that hopefully helping them, see some of this data. I mean, these teams, the professional teams, college teams, they have sleep coaches who work with their athletes because they know sleep is so important. So it is not doing athletes any good to get out there sleep deprived. Not only do they not perform as well in the field, they're also at higher risk for injury.
That's true. All right. Parents, so many parents and caregivers, educators, so many great questions tonight. Wish we could have got to them all. Lisa, what final last words would you like to leave us with tonight?
I think I get back to making sleep a family priority. I will say for me as an adult, I have become much more intentional about my own sleep as a result of being immersed in this research. I think so many of the kind of tips that I gave tonight, I delve into in the book, are relevant for all of us. And that for us as adults to recognize that we need our sleep too, we will do better and we will get along with our kids better.
So well said. Lisa Lewis, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you, Rita Allen and Eva Pang and the Fremont Union High Schools Foundation. Fantastic event. Look for this on our video library coming soon. Everybody who registered will get the link when the video posts. Please do share it with somebody. Take care, everybody. Hope to see you again soon. Good night.